At what was supposed to be the happiest day of his father's life, 8-year-old Lucas stood trembling, his heart pounding as he prepared to expose a dark truth. Just moments before Alexander, his father, was set to marry the woman of his dreams, Lucas summoned all the courage he had to reveal the terrifying secrets hidden beneath Sophia's perfect smile. What he revealed sent shockwaves through the wedding, unraveling a web of deceit and betrayal that no one saw coming. As the police arrived and the celebration turned into a nightmare, one thing became clear: nothing would ever be the same. But how did Lucas uncover Sophia's twisted past? And what consequences would this revelation unleash? Watch the full story unfold in a roller coaster of twists and turns that will leave you guessing until the very end. Hit subscribe, like and share if you're ready for a thrilling ride. The air was thick with excitement as the guests filed into the opulent ballroom, their voices mingling with the soft strains of classical music playing in the background. The towering ceiling, adorned with chandeliers, sparkled like the day itself, and the walls were draped with elegant floral arrangements. It was a scene of perfection, fit for the fairy tale wedding that everyone believed was about to take place. Alexander, the groom, stood at the altar in his tailored tuxedo, his broad shoulders betraying no hint of the nervousness that surely brewed inside. His smile was calm, confident. He was finally ready to move forward, to find happiness again after the devastating loss of his first wife. In the middle of it all was Lucas, his 8-year-old son, dressed in a miniature version of his father's tuxedo. He sat with his small hands balled into fists in his lap, his face contorted with a mixture of apprehension and fear. The excitement that buzzed around him only made him feel more out of place. Everyone was so happy, so certain that this day was going to be perfect. But Lucas knew something no one else did, and he could barely stand it any longer. Across the room, Sophia, the bride-to-be, stood in front of the massive double doors. The guests turned as one when the soft strains of the wedding march began to play, and Sophia, draped in an exquisite lace gown, appeared at the threshold. Her beauty was breathtaking, her elegance unquestionable. She moved with a grace that seemed otherworldly, a serene smile on her face as she walked slowly toward Alexander. Lucas's stomach churned. He gripped the edge of his chair tightly, his eyes never leaving Sophia. She might look like the perfect bride, but Lucas knew what lay beneath that polished exterior. He had seen it, he had felt it, and he could no longer stay silent. As the officiant prepared to begin the ceremony, Lucas took a deep breath. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to stand. "Dad!" His voice rang out, clear and sharp. Every head in the room turned toward the small boy standing by his seat, his face pale, his eyes wide. Alexander, confused, glanced back at his son, a frown creasing his brow. "Lucas?" he said softly, gesturing for him to sit down. "Now's not the time, buddy." But Lucas shook his head. His legs felt weak, but he stood his ground. "I can't let you marry her," he said, his voice trembling. "Sophia isn't who you think she is." A murmur rippled through the guests as Lucas's words hung in the air. Alexander blinked, clearly caught off guard, but Sophia's reaction was immediate. Her serene smile faltered for the briefest of moments before she regained her composure, flashing the crowd a tight-lipped, bemused grin. "Lucas," she began, her voice smooth but tense, "this is a misunderstanding. You're just nervous, sweetheart." But Lucas stepped forward, shaking his head with more conviction now. "No, I'm not. I've seen what you're like when Dad's not around. I've seen what you do. You're not nice. You're mean to everyone." Alexander's confusion deepened. He turned fully toward his son, concern etched into his features. "Lucas, what are you talking about?" Lucas's eyes darted around the room, pleading with anyone to believe him. She grabs me when you're not home. She hurts people, yells at the maids, tells them they're worthless. And..." He hesitated, his voice trembling. "She says I can't tell you because you won't believe me." The ballroom fell into an eerie silence. Even the soft music seemed to disappear into the background. Sophia's smile had now fully evaporated, replaced with a thin-lipped, icy expression. She stepped forward, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. "Lucas is a child," she said, her voice barely holding together. "He's confused. Kids make up stories." But Alexander wasn't so sure. He stared at Lucas, then back at Sophia, a storm brewing in his chest. Lucas had never acted out like this before. He had always been a quiet, introspective child, especially since his mother passed. For him to say something like this, in front of everyone, at such a critical moment, a cold knot began to form in Alexander's stomach. Sophia had always been perfect in every way, at least to Alexander. She'd come into his life like a beacon of light at a time when he thought he'd never feel joy again. After losing his wife in a tragic car accident 3 years prior, he had been devastated. Sophia had been there to help him pick up the pieces, her kindness and beauty easing him through the hardest days. But Lucas had seen something different. He had seen what she was like when Alexander wasn't home. The memory of her grabbing his wrist so tightly that it left red marks came flooding back. It had happened one evening when Lucas accidentally spilled his juice on the kitchen floor. Sophia had been furious, her perfect smile twisting into something ugly. "You clumsy brat," she had hissed, wrenching his wrist painfully. "If you ruin this dress, you'll wish you'd never been born. Don't you dare tell your father or else." Lucas had been too frightened to say anything then. He had hoped it was a one-time thing, that maybe she was just having a bad day. But it happened again. And again. Whenever his father wasn't around, Sophia's true nature showed itself. She was cruel, vindictive, and obsessed with control. And Lucas had begun to realize that she wasn't just a danger to him, she was a danger to his father as well. Back at the altar, Alexander stood frozen, torn between his son's accusations and the woman he thought he knew. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the eyes of every guest on him, waiting to see what he would do next. "Sophia," he began slowly, turning to her with confusion and pain written all over his face. "What is Lucas talking about? Is there any truth to this?" Sophia's face hardened for a fraction of a second before she forced a look of incredulous hurt. "Of course not," she exclaimed, stepping toward him with outstretched hands. "Alexander, you know me. You know how much I love Lucas, how much I love you both. This is just, I don't know why he's saying these things. He must be confused, maybe he's acting out because of the wedding. It's a big change for him." But Lucas's voice cut through her protests. "She's lying. I'm not confused. She's been mean to me and to everyone else for months. She tells the maids they're stupid and yells at them when you're not home." Alexander's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He had always trusted Sophia implicitly, but Lucas had never lied to him before. And the boy's face was so earnest, so full of fear, that it gnawed at him. The guests watched in uncomfortable silence, some whispering to each other, while others exchanged uneasy glances. "Dad," Lucas continued, his voice softer now but no less urgent, "you have to believe me. She's not who you think she is." Sophia's demeanor changed in an instant. The calm, collected woman who had walked down the aisle was gone, replaced by someone who now wore panic on her face like a mask cracking under pressure. She knew the situation was spiraling out of her control, and her usual charm and manipulation wouldn't save her this time. "Alexander, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Don't listen to him. He's just a child. I love you. I love both of you. Don't let him ruin this for us." But Alexander was no longer looking at her. His eyes were on Lucas, and the more he looked at his son, the more he realized that something was terribly wrong. He had been so wrapped up in his own happiness that he hadn't noticed the way Lucas had withdrawn over the past few months. The boy had grown quieter, more distant. And now it was clear why. Alexander's heart twisted painfully in his chest. Could he have been so blind? Alexander turned back to Sophia, and for the first time, he noticed the cracks in her carefully crafted facade. The way her eyes darted around, the tension in her body, signs of a person who had been caught in a lie. "Sophia," he said, his voice steady but filled with tension, "I need to know the truth. Did you hurt Lucas? Did you do the things he's saying?" Sophia's eyes widened, her hands trembling slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For a long, painful moment, the room held its breath. And then, Alexander did something that shocked everyone, including Sophia. He pulled out his phone and began to dial. "Alexander!" Sophia's voice was shrill now, full of panic. "What are you doing?" I'm calling the police, he said, his voice hard. If there's any truth to what Lucas is saying, I want to know. And I want to make sure you can't hurt him or anyone else. Gasps echoed through the ballroom, and the guests began murmuring loudly, the tension reaching a fever pitch. Sophia took a step back, her face pale and her breathing erratic. You can't be serious, she cried. You're going to ruin everything. Our future, our life together. But Alexander wasn't listening. He had made his decision. The call connected, and Alexander spoke the words that would change everything. Yes, I need to report an incident, he said, his voice firm. I'm at a wedding, and my son has just made an accusation. I think we need to investigate this. And with that, the wedding came to an abrupt, shocking end. The call to 911 changed the atmosphere entirely. What had once been a room filled with celebration and joy was now charged with fear, confusion, and uncertainty. The guests whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting between Alexander, Lucas, and Sophia. Some guests began to trickle out, unsure of how to process the shocking turn of events, while others stayed rooted to their seats, waiting to see what would happen next. Alexander stood frozen after the call, staring at the phone in his hand as if it was the heaviest object in the world. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. He had loved Sophia, trusted her, even planned to spend the rest of his life with her. But now, as his son's accusations echoed in his mind, he felt a deep pit forming in his stomach. Sophia, on the other hand, had retreated into a defensive posture. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to gauge the reactions of the guests, but all she saw were looks of suspicion and doubt. The pressure of the situation was getting to her. For the first time, she had lost control of the narrative. Dad, are you okay? Lucas's small voice broke through Alexander's daze. Alexander looked down at his son, seeing the fear and worry etched into his young face. He knelt down, pulling Lucas into a hug, holding him tightly. I'm so sorry, buddy, he whispered. I should have listened to you sooner. Lucas's grip on his father tightened, as if he had been waiting for those words. The weight of the secret he had carried for months lifted off his shoulders, but the fear of what would happen next lingered. Sophia's voice cut through the tense moment. Alexander, she said, her voice trembling but still filled with an edge of desperation. You can't seriously believe this. It's a mistake. I would never hurt Lucas. He's just confused. But Alexander didn't look at her. The trust between them had been shattered, and in his heart, he already knew that there was no going back. It didn't take long for the police to arrive at the grand venue. The sight of patrol cars pulling up outside the elegant hall created a ripple of anxiety among the guests. The flashing lights outside seemed out of place against the backdrop of crystal chandeliers and lavish decor, but they were a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. 2 officers entered the room, their faces serious as they approached Alexander. Mr. Alexander Thompson? One of them asked, addressing the groom. Alexander nodded, his expression heavy with sorrow and uncertainty. That's me. The officer glanced at Lucas, who stood close by his father's side. We received your call. Can you tell us what happened? Alexander gestured toward his son. My son Lucas? He said that my fiancée, Sophia, has been mistreating him and others behind my back. I didn't know. I don't know if it's all true, but I need to know. I need to protect him. The officer looked down at Lucas, his expression softening as he crouched to the boy's eye level. Hey there, Lucas. Do you feel comfortable talking to me? Can you tell me what's been going on? Lucas hesitated, glancing at his father for reassurance. Alexander gave him a small nod, silently encouraging him. The boy took a deep breath and started to recount the months of mistreatment, the coldness Sophia had shown, the way she hurt him and threatened him to keep silent. Sophia, standing off to the side, was trembling with fear and anger. This is ridiculous, she muttered, but the police officer ignored her. As Lucas spoke, the other officer listened closely, taking notes. With every word, Alexander's heart broke a little more. How had he not seen this? How had he let it get this far? When Lucas finished, the officer looked up at his partner and nodded. We'll need to ask some questions to verify things, Mr. Thompson, the officer said, standing up. But for now, we'd like to speak to Sophia. Sophia stepped forward, her face pale but defiant. "This is all a misunderstanding. I love Alexander and Lucas. I would never do anything to hurt them." "We understand, ma'am," the officer said, his tone neutral. "But we'll need to take you in for questioning. We're just following procedure." Sophia's face crumpled as the reality of the situation hit her. "You can't do this. You can't take me away like a criminal. I'm innocent." Alexander stood silently, watching as the police officers carefully escorted Sophia toward the exit. The woman he had once thought he would spend his life with now looked like a stranger to him. Her protests echoed down the hall, but no one made a move to stop the officers. The guests, who had once admired her, now looked at her with suspicion and judgment. As Sophia was led out of the room, the weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on Alexander. He felt drained, overwhelmed, and lost. The wedding had fallen apart, his future with Sophia was in ruins, and his trust in his own judgment had been shattered. What had he missed? What signs had he overlooked? He looked down at Lucas, who was still clutching his hand tightly. "Are you okay, Dad?" Lucas asked, his small voice filled with concern. It was a role reversal that broke Alexander's heart. His 8-year-old son was comforting him, when it should have been the other way around. He knelt down and hugged Lucas again, feeling the depth of his son's bravery. "I will be," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thanks to you." As they sat together, Alexander's mind drifted back to the beginning of his relationship with Sophia. He had been so vulnerable then, grieving the loss of his wife, trying to rebuild a life for Lucas and himself. Sophia had been a bright light in that dark time, offering warmth, charm, and companionship when he needed it most. But now, in the cold light of the truth, he realized that he had been blind. Sophia had preyed on his vulnerability, had manipulated his loneliness to insert herself into his life. He had wanted so badly to believe that happiness was possible again, that he had ignored the subtle signs. The way Sophia dismissed Lucas's concerns, her occasional outbursts of frustration when things didn't go her way, her growing control over their household. And Lucas. His son had been suffering in silence, trying to protect him. The thought was unbearable. The days after the wedding were a blur of police reports, statements, and legal proceedings. Sophia's past began to unravel, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. The police discovered that she had been involved in similar relationships before, each one ending with manipulation, financial control, and emotional abuse. Several of her former partners had filed complaints, but she had always managed to slip away before any real consequences caught up with her. For Alexander, the betrayal cut deep. He had trusted her, opened up his life and his home to her. And now, he had to come to terms with the fact that the woman he had loved had never truly loved him in return. But more than anything, he had to face the guilt he felt toward Lucas. He had failed to protect his son, failed to see the truth when it was right in front of him. That guilt gnawed at him every day. "Lucas," Alexander said one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set in the distance, "I want you to know something. I'm so proud of you. You were so brave to speak up, even when it was hard. You saved us both from something terrible." Lucas looked up at him, his face softening. "I just didn't want you to get hurt, Dad." Alexander smiled sadly. "You shouldn't have had to protect me. That's my job. And I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening sooner. But I promise you, from now on, I'll always listen to you. I'll always believe you." Lucas nodded, leaning against his father's side. "I know, Dad. I believe you." As the days turned into weeks, Alexander focused on rebuilding the trust that had been fractured between him and Lucas. They spent more time together, doing the things they used to love. Fishing at the lake, playing catch in the backyard, building Legos in the living room. Slowly but surely, the shadows of Sophia's betrayal began to lift. But Alexander knew that the road to healing would be long. For both of them. As the investigation into Sophia's past continued, more disturbing details came to light. The police discovered that Sophia had legally changed her name several years ago, just before she met Alexander. Under her previous identity, she had a history of fraud, coercion, and emotional abuse. In one particularly troubling case, an ex-fiancé had filed a restraining order against her after she threatened him when he tried to break off their engagement. It became clear that Sophia had a pattern of targeting wealthy, emotionally vulnerable men, gaining their trust and isolating them from their families. She used charm and manipulation to control them, often draining them of financial resources before disappearing and moving on to her next target. For Alexander, learning the full extent of Sophia's deception was like being hit with a second wave of betrayal. He had been so close to falling into the same trap. If it hadn't been for Lucas, he might have lost everything. The police interviewed Alexander and Lucas multiple times as they pieced together Sophia's history. Each time, Alexander grew more grateful that Lucas had found the courage to speak up. The more they uncovered, the more he realized how dangerous Sophia had been. With Sophia's arrest and subsequent legal battles looming, Alexander and Lucas focused on rebuilding their lives. The media had caught wind of the story, and for a while, it seemed like their faces were plastered across every news outlet. Reporters hounded Alexander for interviews, but he refused to speak publicly, wanting to protect Lucas from the spotlight. Despite the chaos, there was a sense of peace returning to their home. The toxic presence that had once dominated their lives was gone, and Alexander was determined to create a stable, loving environment for his son. Lucas started therapy to help process the trauma he had endured during Sophia's time in their lives. At first, he was hesitant, but slowly he began to open up. The weight he had carried for so long was finally being lifted, and with each passing day, he grew more confident and at ease. Alexander, too, found solace in therapy. He had been carrying his own burden of guilt and grief for so long that he hadn't realized how much it had affected him. Therapy allowed him to confront those feelings and start the process of healing. He learned to forgive himself for the mistakes he had made and to trust his instincts again. The bond between father and son grew stronger with each passing day. They found joy in the simple things, cooking meals together, watching movies, and talking late into the night. The love they had for each other became the foundation of their new life, one built on trust, honesty, and understanding. Months passed, and the legal proceedings against Sophia dragged on. She was facing multiple charges, not just for her treatment of Lucas and Alexander but also for her actions in previous relationships. Her lawyers tried to paint her as a victim, but the overwhelming evidence against her made it clear that she had been the predator all along. In the end, Sophia was sentenced to several years in prison for fraud, emotional abuse, and coercion. It was a small measure of justice, but for Alexander and Lucas, it brought a sense of closure. They could finally move on from the nightmare she had brought into their lives. With the legal battles behind them, Alexander and Lucas decided to take a fresh start. They sold the house they had shared with Sophia and moved to a smaller, quieter town where no one knew their story. It was a chance to start over, to leave the past behind and build a new future together. Alexander found a new job, one that allowed him to spend more time with Lucas. He made a conscious effort to be more present, to listen more carefully, and to cherish the time they had together. Lucas, for his part, thrived in their new home. He made new friends, joined a soccer team, and excelled in school. The darkness that had once clouded his life was gone, replaced by the warmth of love and stability. As the years passed, the memories of Sophia faded, but the lessons they had learned stayed with them. Lucas grew into a confident, compassionate young man, and Alexander became a more attentive, empathetic father. They talked openly about their feelings, never letting secrets fester or go unspoken. Their relationship had been tested by fire, but it had emerged stronger than ever. In therapy, Lucas learned that it was okay to ask for help, that speaking up was not a sign of weakness but of courage. He realized that he wasn't responsible for the actions of others, and that his father's love was unconditional. Alexander, too, found peace in the knowledge that he had done everything he could to protect his son. He had made mistakes, but he had also made the right choice when it mattered most. And for that he could forgive himself. Their lives were no longer dominated by fear or uncertainty. They were free to live, to love, and to move forward without the shadows of the past holding them back. As Lucas entered his teenage years, he and Alexander continued to navigate life together, leaning on each other for support. Their bond had become unbreakable, forged in the crucible of hardship and strengthened by their mutual love and trust. Lucas thrived in school, and Alexander couldn't have been prouder. He watched his son grow into a thoughtful, resilient young man, and he knew that no matter what challenges life threw at them, they would face them together. And so, with the pain of the past behind them, they looked toward the future with hope and determination, ready to embrace whatever came next.